Okay, so welcome back to class, Dr. Fine. It's great to see you again.
Thank you. It's good to be with you.
Alrighty, so tonight we are talking about some of your experience working with cancer research and what that has to do with cell division and what we're working on in class. So if we could get started by you just sharing with us some of your background with cancer research.
Okay. Well, thank you for that question. So, in my years of being a researcher, uh, the majority of those years were actually spent in doing cancer research. So I do have over 25 years of cancer research. And during those years, most of the time I was working at the Frederick Cancer Research Center at Fort Detrick. And during that time, I was doing basic research studies and I was working with viruses that were known or believed to cause cancer. And so that was one of my specialties. And so some of the things that I did and my laboratory group did was develop model systems for studying cancer, in particular studying how viruses could alter a normal cell and make it a cancer-prone type of cell. And then later on in my career, I was responsible for establishing a drug screening operation at Frederick to attempt to identify natural products which could be used to treat cancer. Um, Natural products have been used for hundreds of years, particularly by indigenous people in South America and Africa. And so the National Cancer Institute felt that if those were potentially useful drugs for treating cancer or AIDS, which was another aspect that we were working on, but I know we're talking tonight about cancer. And the other thing that I would sort of add to my quiver of arrows regarding cancer is that I've been involved in either being the chairman or serving on institutional review boards. Now, for your students may not understand what that term is, that following World War II, our government and many other governments established institutional review boards for protection of human subjects. So in other words, human beings could no longer be used as, excuse the expression, guinea pigs. So any research that involves humans, and obviously cancer research would involve humans, requires a review committee, both scientific as well as sociological, to review those kinds of studies. And so I have served on that review board, and right over the last number of years, it's been at Frederick Memorial Hospital for any cancer research studies that's ongoing in the Frederick community. So it's a little bit of my background.
That's pretty amazing. So, what led you to choose this work within cancer research?
Well, it was sort of a fortuitous type of thing because once I got out of graduate school, I did come to Fort Detrick, but I worked for the Department of the Army. And then President Nixon closed down what was then the Biological Warfare Center for the United States. And so I went sort of looking for a job. And I was offered a position in Kensington, Maryland, working for the company called Litton Bionetics Incorporated. And so I was chosen for that job as a senior scientist. And I began to conduct research on trying to determine what cancer was caused by. And we were using um, baby monkeys. We refer to them as neonates, being newborns, because they are have their immune system is not very well developed, and so if they were susceptible to cancer, it might give us some clue as to why humans were susceptible to cancer. You're,
I'm on mute. Sorry about that. So let's take it back to when we were talking about the coronavirus. We really broke down, is a virus a living thing, organism? So is cancer a living organism? or is it a virus?
Well, yes, it is. In fact, every type of cancer that I've ever heard of is actually a living organism because it's actually an altered cell. And in many cases, and I'm sure that your students have learned about diploid cells and somatic cells and things like that. So in most cases, what cancer is, it is an altered cell from the organism. And that could be from any kind of organism that is warm-blooded and perhaps even some cold-blooded animals can get cancer. So a virus is not cancer. A virus can cause cancer in some cases, and we'll talk about that a little bit later.
So, what happens in a cell to cause that mutation for it to become a cancerous cell?
Well, as again, most likely your students have learned or are beginning to learn a little bit about the cell cycle. And so from the time that we are born and we develop into an adult, those cells double every 24 to 36 hours, and consequently the animal and we humans grow. But at a certain point in our life, we stop growing and only some cells continue to divide, such as our blood cells and a few other, some of our immune cells, etc., and skin cells. But when a organism, an animal, a human, gets to a certain point, most of their cells stop dividing because they stop at the end of G1 phase of the cell cycle. What cancer does, however, is it disrupts that block that occurs at the end of G1, and the cell continues to divide. And it divides nonstop because there's nothing to control it. The genetic mechanism in the cell has been altered as a result of either the virus or a mutation or a chemical mutation, caused mutation, or radiation-induced mutation. So one of those types of external factors has destroyed the ability of the cell to stop dividing, and it just continues to divide.
Okay, that's a really good explanation. All right. So, how does a cancer cell metabolize energy differently than a normal cell, and how is that significant?
Well, in answering that question, I'm going to sort of give you an example of what happens in a newborn baby, okay? The newborn baby needs to grow, and his or her cells need to divide in order to grow. And so a baby consumes a lot of food relative to their weight. And I think if a baby had the opportunity, they probably would eat 24 hours a day as long as they kept hungry. As we get older, we require less food. However, if an organism develops cancer, it reverts back to this thing that I was talking about before, that the cells are dividing constantly. And in order for a cell to divide, it requires energy. Where does the energy come from? It comes from our food. So the cancer cells are metabolizing our food at a high rate in order to get the energy required for that cancer cell to divide. In the meantime, other cells in the body are suffering because they are not getting the nutrients. And so that's why it's very important in therapy of cancer that they encourage individuals to eat a healthy diet, to take extra vitamins, etc., particularly if they're in the elderly classification of people. They need that extra supplement because the cancer cell is depleting them of energy.
Yeah, I have a friend who's going through cancer treatment, and they've told her to cut out all sugar, that feeds the cancer even more rapidly.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah. Okay. So, what are some of the causes of cancer? Is it genetic, environmental, and is it contagious?
Well, I can answer all of those sort of in this order. That yes, cancer can result from a genetic change. Um, some people inherit genes that make them cancer prone, and I'll give you a couple examples of that as we go along. Breast cancer is one that some families um, pass along um, a set of chromosomes that are basically duplicated, and these are the this is the part of the chromosome that is responsible for cell division to continue to occur. So if a woman has inherited multiple copies of that particular gene, she is more likely to develop cancer, particularly if it is the type of cancer that hormones will, and particularly the female hormones, will catalyze or you know, produce. So, and in men, prostate cancer is an example. And as I mentioned the other day, prostate cancer ran in my family. My father had it, and I developed an early form of it and was successfully treated. So um, there is a genetic predisposition to some of these types of cancer. Now, is it environmental? Well, it's caused by environmental factors. Ultraviolet radiation from the sunlight is an example. Some of the carcinogens that are released when we grill meat um, to an excessive temperature. Some of those juices are converted to chemicals that are known to cause cancer. Pesticides, exposure to pesticides. In fact, Roundup is currently one of the big chemicals that has been used to control wild grasses and things like that. But it's believed that if somebody is using Roundup and they inhale too much of the fumes, or they may get it on their skin, that it's likely to cause a certain type of leukemia. So there's a number of examples that I could cite. But so those would be environmental. Is it contagious? Only those that are induced by a virus. And I can also mention those a little bit later when we get to that.
So, I would like to ask a question about the Roundup. So, the GMO seeds that now have Roundup built into their structure, what does that have the same impact as the when it's in a fume form?
Well, I had trouble when I first heard about Roundup being a possible cause of some
Mm-hmm.
type of cancer, because I know that the mechanism of Roundup is to interrupt a stage in the photosynthetic cycle. And of course,
Mm-hmm.
humans don't photosynthesize cholesterol. I mean, sorry, chlorophyll. We make cholesterol, but not chlorophyll. Um, and so I thought, well, this is nonsense, and it's nothing to be afraid of. However, there seems to be accumulating evidence that one type of leukemia uh, is higher in people who have worked with it, like farm workers or people
Mm-hmm.
who have worked for the state and were
Mm-hmm.
spraying it. So I think that court is still out, so to speak, as
Okay.
to whether
Uh-huh.
Roundup should be taken off the market, because there may be other molecular mechanisms by which it does change the cell.
Yeah. Right. Okay. Thanks. So, are there populations of people that are at greater risk of getting cancer?
Yes, I've already given you some examples, and that would be families, women, women in the family who might be inheriting an excess number of these promoter genes from mother. And then I also wanted to point out, as I did the other day, that colon cancer appears to be also something that might be inherited. And the reason I say that is because my mother and her brother both died of colon cancer at relatively young ages. So at the age of 40, I went in for my first colonoscopy, and indeed I had some precancerous lesions. And so I get checked every 5 years until I've been cancer-free, whatever, because it can run in families. Um, and so I always mentioned to my class when I was teaching biology that don't be afraid when you get to that age, particularly if there's some cancer in your family. Don't be afraid to go get a colonoscopy. I've had a lot of them. I always say that the best part of it is the day that you, after you come out of anesthesia and the doctor says, go have something to eat and just relax the rest of the day. So it's a non-painful procedure, and it's good to be reassured that you don't have the disease.
Yeah, I hear the cleansing process is the one to
Yeah,
that's the process that's a little rough.
well, it has gotten better. I had a colonoscopy maybe 2 months ago. It was one of my 5-year routines. And the preparation that's now is really a cakewalk, so to speak. So it's
Yeah,
not at all.
well, that's good.
I did want
Good
to,
for technology to move forward there.
yeah. I did want to mention before we go on that there are populations that because of their diet, so it's non-genetic, but perhaps there's something in their diet that either prevents cancer or which they have a low risk of cancer, or that promotes it. And I learned a number of years ago of a study that was done where they looked at a certain number of individuals from Japan, so Japanese population, and they found that they were very low in very low risk of having stomach cancer. And that was attributed to the fact that probably the Japanese eat a lot of fish, and they don't eat a lot of cooked beef or something like that. And then they looked at Japanese people who settled in Hawaii, or their families had settled in Hawaii. And so they found that there was a higher incidence of stomach cancer in those that lived in Hawaii of Japanese descent than from Japan. And then they looked at Japanese who had immigrated to the United States. And lo and behold, they had the highest incidence of stomach cancer. And it's believed that it's because as they came to the United States, their eating habits changed and they began to eat beef and then they began to barbecue meat and who knows what else. But clearly it was not a genetic thing that had to do with whatever diet they were eating. Very interesting study.
Yeah, that is very so. Can only humans get
No, in fact, we're sort of at the top of the totem pole because, and I refer back to one time I had asked somebody the question, can whales, since whales are mammals, can whales get cancer? And there actually were a couple of reports of whales or some sea mammals, like porpoises, dolphins, and things like that, that were found to have cancer. But literally chickens, other domestic fowl, frogs, horses, cows, dogs, cats, all types of monkeys, New World monkeys, which means South America, Old World monkeys means African or Asian, baboons, all can get cancer, all have been found to have cancer. So we're not alone in this. And it's probably because literally all of those species that I mentioned do carry the genes that can code for tumor viruses. And those are referred to the oncogenic viruses because their genetic sequence contains a oncogene, which is cancer stimulating.
okay. Um, can plants get cancer as well?
I'm sorry?
Can plants get cancer as well?
Oh yeah, and I'm so happy that you mentioned that because if one just heard what I just said, they would say, well, then, Dr. Fine didn't mention anything about plants. But indeed, there are several types of tumors that can occur in plants. Some of them occur as a result of an insect bite. Some of them occur as a result of what the plant is metabolizing in terms of nutrients, etc. And so, yeah, there is. And some of them, they're not harmful to humans, but they're certainly, it's not the kind of thing that you'd want to eat. So it can destroy the crops, but it's exclusively to the plant.
I just lost you. Can other folks hear Dr. Fine? Is it just me?
I can hear him.
Okay. Yeah.
Right, so it's me. Okay.
Okay. So then I presume that your students.
This happens to me far too often. All right, let me get off of this thing then.
All right. Can you hear me now?
Yes. Mm-hmm. Can you hear me?
Okay.
Yeah, that's what I'm thinking too, Cruz.
Maybe your battery went dead in the headset.
Oh man, where? Okay. Right, I can hear things now. Okay.
And another student doing this.
My apologies. All right. So, okay. How does cancer spread in an organ, and what do the different stages mean?
Okay. Well, cancer spreads by a process called, from organ to organ or throughout the organ itself, by a process called metastasis. And so some cancers actually metastasize by secreting a growth factor, which stimulates cell division and other things, which then attracts the cancer cell throughout the organ or outside of the organ. And one of these factors is called angiogenesis factor. And it was discovered, so to speak, by a scientist named Judah Folkman. And I met Judah Folkman many years ago at a Cold Spring Harbor Cancer Symposium up in New York. And so he was the one to identify this factor that circulates through the bloodstream. And that factor is responsible normally for growth of capillaries and veins and arteries in the growing animal. So as a baby grows, the body makes this angiogenesis factor, which stimulates the growth of blood vessels, and that's how the blood vessels arise. Well, what Judah Folkman found was that the same kind of factor was being produced by the cancer cell to attract new growth of blood vessels to it, and then it had a channel by which the cancer cell could spread throughout the body. And so that was a major finding in the whole understanding of cancer. Oh, and then you asked about the different stages, did you not? Okay, so I'm going to give as an example the staging that are listed for pancreatic cancer. And the reason I do that, and I'll be very blunt about it, is to tell your class that my son-in-law, his name was Rich, passed away 2 years ago at the age of 48 from pancreatic cancer. And it was not diagnosed in him because it was one of these diseases that's not diagnosed until it moves along to a very aggressive stage. So to start at the beginning, stage 0 is called in situ cancer, and that means that it's confined just to a very small portion of the pancreas, the outer portion. And so if we were able to treat pancreatic cancer when we first knew it was there, it'd be very easy to solve pancreatic cancer, but it goes undetected, at least until it gets further, and I'll get to that. Stage 1, which would be the next stage, it's still confined to the pancreas, but there's still no sign of it. Stage 2, it's confined to the pancreas, but now it's beginning to spread to the adjacent lymph nodes. And lymph nodes are part of your immune system that basically keeps bacteria and viruses and cancer from spreading. But now the cancer is in the lymph node in stage 2. In stage 3, which may be the first time it's detectable because it begins to affect other organs, the tumor is now greater than 4 centimeters. And if you can even conceive of that, that's probably about 2 inches in diameter. It's getting rather large, about the size of a golf ball, something like that. That's usually when pancreatic cancer is diagnosed, because the person begins to have yellow skin because some of their digestive juices aren't working properly, etc. And so the cancer is also spreading throughout the blood vessels to other organs, which is going to be affecting, the way you feel and so on. By stage 4, which was when Rich's cancer was detected, it was not only throughout his pancreas, but it has also spread to his liver, etc. And so he lived less than a year. I had an uncle who died back in probably the 1950s. I was young at that time, obviously. And my uncle was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer. He lived 2 weeks from the time of diagnosis, 2 weeks. So we have better means of diagnosing, but we don't have that good a screening system to be able to detect it at one of the early stages. So those are some examples of how tumors are staged by pathologists.
I am very sorry to hear about Rich and your uncle so long ago, but pancreatic cancers, that's a hard one. I think that's similar to ovarian cancer, that one takes a long time to diagnose as well.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Okay, so how does the cancer then spread throughout the body to go through these different stages?
Well, as I noted on one of the recent questions, the process is called metastasis, but basically what the tumor is doing is it's finding sort of conduits throughout the body to spread. And the bloodstream is one, and the lymphatic system is the other. Once the cell has escaped into the bloodstream, you can imagine it just travels to wherever it will next likely end up. Many tumors metastasize to the lung. And the reason is because if you think about it, the lung is sort of a filter system. It's where you have very thin membranes, because you have carbon dioxide leaving the lungs, oxygen coming into the lungs. And so a tumor cell is passing through very small capillaries in the lung, and it's getting lodged there. And of course it's dividing, so the next thing you know, you have a tumor in the lung. So many times a tumor may not originate in the lung, but that's where it ends up, and that's where it really causes problems. Other tumors will metastasize to the brain, and some others to the liver, etc. So, in fact, there's a man from our church who had a primary tumor just a month or so ago in his leg, and when they went to treat him, they found out that it had already spread to close to his kidneys. So that's quite a ways for the tumor cell to travel.
Okay, so what is the most common type of cancer?
When I started planning for this class, I looked it up so I could answer that question, because even though I had predicted it was breast cancer, in fact, that's what Googling confirmed. And so breast cancer is the most common, with over 270,000 new cases reported each year in the United States. So if you think about worldwide, there's probably millions of individuals getting breast cancer. And second to that, or the more common cancers, are lung cancer. And for part of the reason that I just mentioned, that you have some cancers that metastasize to the lung, but also things such as smoking, inhaling industrial, smoke in a factory or something like that. The lung is very susceptible to getting cancer. And prostate cancer is almost up there as high as lung. However, prostate cancer is much more easily treated than is lung cancer. And then next to that would be colon and rectal cancers.
So there are many different types of cancer. Can we reduce all of these different types of cancer into a set of common traits?
Yes, we can. It's when I say it's relatively easy to do, I mean what I mean by that is it's relatively easy for a person who's trained in histology or histopathology to be able to identify what type of tumor it is, regardless of where it originates. But pathologists, doctors per se, will define a cancer as being perhaps a carcinoma, which would be a solid tumor in one of the major organs, or a sarcoma, which would be also a solid tumor that might occur in something like muscle or cartilage or something like that. The melanomas would be the whole category of skin cancers, and there being at least 3 different major types. And malignant melanoma is the most deadly, because that spreads very rapidly and can be recognized very easily because it has melanin pigment, meaning dark pigment. Lymphomas and leukemias are basically the types of cancer that occur in the lymphatic system, or in the bloodstream, or in the spleen, or one of the lymphatic organs. So if you hear a term used with respect to a particular type of cancer, hearing part of it being like a choriocarcinoma, you say, okay, that's a solid tumor, and it has to do with something in the female genital tract, or if it's a breast cancer, a breast carcinoma, so it's a solid tumor in the breast. And so it's a descriptive term, that it's also a histological term.
So I think most people know somebody who has been affected by cancer. It seems so common now. Is this a new disease, or has this been floating around in history and we're just now catching it?
Yes, that's a great question, Katie. So cancer has been around for ages. And I think if we were to look at old textbooks or old writings, we'd find that they would say so-and-so died of a tumor. And that was about all they knew. If it was observable, it was given the name tumor. But even back at the time, one of my grandparents died of cancer, grandmother, and her death certificate was just, a blood tumor, something like that, because they didn't know anything about leukemias, etc. So cancer's been around for, a long time. But it's perhaps only in the past 100 years that we've really come to understand a little bit about cancer. And if you think about the fact that the National Cancer Act was mandated by President Nixon in the year 1971. And that's not too long ago. At that point, we didn't know anything about cancer relative to what we know about now. As we talked about before, some people thought, oh, it's a virus, it's caused by a virus. Other people thought, oh, there's only one kind of cancer, so if we can cure it, we can cure all cancers. In fact, President Nixon said, well, we put a man on the moon so we can cure cancer in 10 years. He was quoted like that. Well, after 10 years, like 1981, we knew hardly anything more than we knew in 1971. However, we knew that there were some cancers that were caused by viruses. We knew that there were different kinds of cancer, and more than likely there were different causes. And so the National Cancer Program went out and looked for causes. And so that was basically how I got a job, because they were believing that some types of cancer were caused by virus. So, I'm sorry, there was another point that I wanted to make, and that is that cancer is more prevalent now. And it's probably because human behavior has changed, even in the past 30 or 40 years. We eat a lot more processed food and not natural food. We eat a lot more food that has been genetically modified. And let me clarify for the class, it's not the genetic modification that causes it. It's perhaps what the genetic modification is doing to the normal food product that's making it, less healthy for you. So it's not causing the cancer, but it's certainly not helping.
Okay.
And we are exposed to a lot of environmental factors. We love to go out in the sun, so there's a higher incidence of melanoma. We love to barbecue meat and go out and have a barbecue or whatever. And it's known that anything in excess can cause some sort of illness, and cancer.
Right. So how can knowing the mutations that have happened within the cell or within the genetic structure, how can that be a part of a patient's treatment?
Okay, that's a great question too, and I hope that I can give you some good examples of this. Perhaps one of the best examples I can give in terms of understanding how a patient's cancer can determine what's the best treatment for it. And so I will, use the case of Angelina Jolie. Okay, so Angelina Jolie has a family history of breast cancer. Some of her sisters and aunts, maybe a mother, whatever, all developed breast cancer. So Angelina Jolie had a mastectomy and probably an ovarectomy long before she had any symptoms of cancer. So for those individuals who have a higher potential of getting breast cancer, and we know that breast cancer is caused by, or it's catalyzed or stimulated by female hormones, being able to know the genotype, and we can now do genotypes on a patient's tissues, on a biopsy, and say, okay, this person is estrogen positive or progesterone positive. That can be used then to sort of tailor-make the treatment for that person. And I know for a fact, because many of these types of studies have come before our institutional review board, many times there'll be a discovery of a new compound that will block the ability of the hormone to induce cancer in a woman. And so they'll suggest that woman will take certain types of chemical treatment or pharmaceutical type treatment that blocks that hormone from advancing the cancer. And so women that that are, E positive, estrogen positive, progesterone positive, etc. They may have a higher or lower incidence of cancer depending upon their treatment. So there's some examples of how they sort of can tailor-make the regimen. And then there's other types of cancers that, because they're localized, we know that they can be destroyed by radiation or by other immune modulators, which the cancer cell may require a certain immune factor. And so the person is given a drug treatment that inhibits that, hormone or whatever from triggering or promoting the cancer.
Okay, so in reference to cancer, what does epigenetic mean? And what is the significance of this understanding in cancer treatment?
Okay, well, the term epigenetic, Katie, refers to some factor that arises from a non-genetic influence. In other words, what we've been talking about all along has to do with the cancer cell being mutated or transforming from normal to malignant. Well, in an epigenetic scenario, nothing changes as far as the genetic part of the cell, but something external to it will cause this normal cell to begin to divide. It's not a mutation, it's an external factor. And so as long as we can identify what those factors are and what portion of the genetic makeup of the cell is stimulated, we can use that as an approach to keep cancer from continuing to divide.
Thank you for that. What are the different treatments that doctors are using to treat cancer?
Well, there's basically 3 to 4 different ones. I've already mentioned in a couple of instances tonight chemotherapy, which involves the use of chemicals or some sort of a chemical natural product or maybe a synthetic industrial product that from pharmaceutical that is used to treat. And that was traditionally, before we knew a little bit more about the immunological approach, that was basically the whole plan for the National Cancer Program was to use chemicals to destroy cancer or to inhibit it. But chemicals have a lot of side effects. And so it was probably in the 1980s and 90s that we began to realize that there were immune factors or factors that were circulating in the immune system or in the blood that also stimulated cancer. And so there have been a number of compounds developed that treat the cancer from an immunological standpoint, not by destroying it, but by stopping its growth through an immunity. There's a whole part of a whole aspect of your natural immunity called killer immune cells. And these are lymphocytes that circulate through your bloodstream and have the capability of recognizing and destroying a cancer cell. But what you need to do is you need to be able to stimulate that natural killer cell. And so now we know that there's types of therapy where if a patient has a cancer at an early stage, they can remove some of that cancer from the patient, take it to the laboratory, sort of destroy that cancer, but expose it to the person's white blood cells that contain these killer cells. The killer cells then proliferate in tissue culture in the laboratory, but now then they can be re-administered back to the patient. So the patient now has sort of an accelerated population of their own cells that can seek out and destroy their own cancer. And it's a beautiful scenario, and part of that was actually developed at the Frederick Cancer Center and tested at Frederick Memorial Hospital. And I was involved in that, not doing the research, but in particular in terms of supporting the investigators that were doing that. Oh, so that's two types. Radiation.
Really cool.
Radiation is the third type, and the use of radiation, particularly X-rays and high-intensity radiation, has been used for decades in treating certain types of solid tumors. My father was treated with sort of a regimen of X-ray directly at the prostate. However, there's a lot of peripheral damage that occurs when you have that type of radiation. So they came up with a more directed type of high energy radiation in the past 20 years. And when I had my early form of prostate cancer, I had that directed radiation. And so I had very, very little side effects. And so then there are combinations of these. And many times you'll hear of somebody that has a cancer and they'll say, well, the first thing that we're going to do is have that person have so many doses of radiation, and then they'll have chemotherapy. Or maybe it's just the opposite. They might treat the person with either immunotherapy or chemotherapy, and then follow up with periodic radiation, low intensity radiation, in case there are some cancer cells that have sort of escaped away from the primary.
So these are effective treatments, but why do they make our patients so sick?
Well, as I mentioned a few minutes ago, and I'll use this reference to the chemicals, the cancer program conducted this massive screening operation of looking at hundreds of thousands of chemical compounds and thousands of natural products that were taken from all sorts of sources around the world. And I was part of that program at Frederick, and we would screen 60,000 compounds per year in 60 different tumor cell lines. Well, the ideal cancer agent is one that kills only cancer cells and not normal cells. And unfortunately, that's very rare, because even if you get sort of the gold nugget of cancer chemicals, there's always some side effect, and that's because it is doing such an effective job in killing the cancer cells that there's going to be some side effects. And it may be because there's cells in the periphery of the tumor that are also getting killed, or it could be byproducts of the breakdown of the cancer. But nonetheless, all of these treatments do have some side effects. I mean, I'll be very frank, even though I had these side effects for a few weeks, it was a little miserable, but I knew that I would get over it. And so I monitored the number of hours that I was awake and my pain level. And I could actually do it on a chart and see that, okay, I'm getting better. It's worth it.
Yeah, my understanding is that is not a pleasant process. So that's a good way, if you're a planner, to be able to see the bigger picture there. Yeah. So then what happens to a person's immune system then during treatment? Are they more susceptible to getting sick in other ways?
Yes, they are, because many times as I just mentioned, with regard to the treatment that not only affects the cancer cell, but affects the normal cells. Well, the same thing happens when in treatment of somebody, particularly if the immune response is part of your natural defense or is involved in it. And also, if the type of cancer you have is not localized, but in fact is in the bloodstream, like leukemias and lymphomas, in that case, you're literally, in killing off the cancer cells, you're severely damaging the normal white blood cells, or making the person anemic because their blood-forming red cells have been hindered as a result of the treatment. So the most successful treatments are with the least side effects are the ones that are localized to one spot.
Mhm. Okay, so then people who are being treated for cancer, are they at a greater risk of contracting the COVID virus?
Yes, most certainly they are, because as you may have heard, and your students may have heard, that COVID-19 is claiming the most lives, so to speak, and making people the most sick, who are elderly, who are immunosuppressed. Maybe they are living for not a healthy lifestyle. They're elderly, whatever. And in the elderly, the immune system is already compromised. And so the virus on top of that is really making the person immunocompromised. And consequently, if they have cancer, there's nothing in terms of their natural resistance to be able to fight it off. And also the use of the type of treatment, which we've already defined as sometimes being very hazardous to your health, to give a very toxic regimen of chemotherapy to somebody who has COVID and has a tumor is almost life-threatening.
How about folks who have recovered from cancer? Are they still at a high risk for having such severe and fatal reactions?
I would say if the person was not immune compromised before cancer treatment, they have a very good chance of coming through it and bouncing right back. Because
Okay.
the immune system is always at work. It's part of your body that every day it's making new white blood cells, it's making new red blood cells. Your spleen is working at a high level. Even some other tissues in the body are producing hemoglobin and cells. And so it'll bounce right back once the therapy is finished.
Okay. So, is there a vaccine to prevent cancer?
Yes, for some forms there is. There's at least 2 to 3 that I'm familiar with, and I'll mention those. There's a vaccine for HPV. That's a papillomavirus that affects juveniles particularly, and can also affect women at an older age. There's Epstein-Barr virus, which causes a form of, can cause Burkitt's lymphoma in some individuals, or nasopharyngeal carcinoma in the Orient. And then there was one other, there's hepatitis B virus, which is caused by a virus. And so there's vaccines for each one of these. So that's the bottom line. That's what you were asking me. So note that each of these cancers that there is a vaccine for is caused by a virus, which helps you understand why there's not a broad spectrum type of cancer vaccine. And it's because there are all these multiple forms of cancer, and many cancers are patient specific. In other words, let's say that there's 2 individuals and they both have lung cancer, and they develop a vaccine for lung cancer. More than likely, it may help one person but not another, because in the development of that cancer vaccine, they're most likely using some of the tumor from that particular patient for this other patient to make a cocktail, so to speak, vaccine specific for treating that person.
That's a costly endeavor, I would imagine.
Yes, indeed.
Yeah. So, I've been talking a while, asking a lot of questions. So, students, I would like to open the floor to you all for questions that you may have for Dr. Fine. And if you're more comfortable putting them into the chat, that's okay too. But you're welcome to turn on your microphone and ask.
I have a question. Dr. Fine mentioned that you participated in researching natural products for cancer treatments. If a person were to say that they were looking for a natural or alternative path for their own cancer treatment or prevention, what would be the best way to go about it, or the best advice?
If I want to be sure I understand your question, but it sounds like you're saying that if somebody wanted to use a natural approach, so to speak, to treat their cancer, how to go about doing that. And I would be afraid to advise that because I'm not a medical doctor. However, I will give you an example of a natural product that has been very successfully used in treating one particular type of cancer. Maybe you are familiar with a little blue flower that we find in many of our gardens or at the edge of the lawn. It's called periwinkle, or it also has a name called vinca minor. It was found some years ago that the extract of the vinca minor, called vincristine, and another one called vinblastine, were both natural products, but they have been used very successfully with childhood leukemia in treating children. Very few side effects and very high survival rates. So that, knowing that was a major reason why the National Cancer Institute led a large effort to find other natural products that might have been used in some civilizations, such as in South America or Africa, for treatment of diseases. And so as a result of that, a number of new compounds have come about that are using very successfully. And so they are natural products. And so they have very little side effect, but a very high proficiency of success. So, and I'm sure there's a lot of folklore that is practical, but I'm not saying that somebody should just, read the first book they find that it sounds like it's a successful treatment and go out and try it. That's not a good thing to do.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Does anybody else have any other questions?
I actually had a question. There's time.
Okay.
So,
All right.
Dr. Fine, you mentioned like how the process of like grilling meats can like lead to the development of like cancer if you eat a lot of them. I believe, you can correct me if I'm wrong here, but what is it about that process of like cooking meat that causes the cancer to potentially develop within the people who consume it?
Okay, Stuart, that's a very good question. So I will sort of give you the chemical basis to that understanding about cooked meat. Of course, all meat, particularly fatty type of meat, meat that has fat in it, has fat types compounds in them, like cholesterol, et cetera, fatty acids, et cetera. And so what was found is that in the drippings, when, let's say, somebody is grilling a steak, and maybe it has a lot of fat on it. And so that fat begins to break down as a result of the heat. And in the process, the drippings that's coming off that fat are converted to a carcinogen called benzanthracene. And so then that ends up on the smoke that's in the meat. And so everybody likes to have, you know, their meat maybe grilled and it's blackened from the smoke and makes it taste really good, whatever. But an excess amount of that, it's known that will you know, contain benzanthracene. So you're basically eating the chemical that you created when you were grilling the meat. And so there's other examples, but that's sort of the classic one.
Thank you.
Welcome.
Right, we have time for one more question. Anyone else? All right, then ladies and gentlemen, I'll let you go for the evening. There's a lot going on in that week 6 folder, so please make sure that you're going in there and really get into this cell division work. I also want to say Dr. Fine is one of our amazing biology tutors. So if you have any questions about cell division, meiosis, mitosis, there's here's the person that you get to talk to about it. How amazing is that? So I'm just putting it out there. You have a lab exam in 2 weeks. All right, so have a great evening. Send me an email if you have any questions at all. And Dr. Fine, thank you so much for joining us tonight.
Well, thank you, Katie, and thank you, class. I enjoyed this. It's really something that I look forward to doing. So I hope that I can be talking to you again.
All right, thank you. Okay, we'll be here for a couple more minutes if you have any questions you want to ask as everyone's leaving. That'd be fine.
Thank you. Good night.